In 2010, a team of researchers led by Jane Hurst at the University of Liverpool were studying mice. Specifically, they were determining what it is that attracts a female mouse to a particular male mouse. What they found is that each male mouse secretes a unique protein in their urine that, and I quote, stimulates female memory and sexual attraction to an individual male's odor. As the lead researcher, Dr. Hurst was free to name this protein whatever she wanted, and she decided on Darcin. Her reason was, and I quote, much like Mr. Darcy had a magnetic pull on Elizabeth Bennet, the protein is a pheromone responsible for attracting female mice to a particular male. It's good to know. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about the popularity of Jane Austen and her fluent influence on society. I rather doubt she would, in her wildest dreams, ever have imagined one of her heroes associated with the desirability of a mouse. Yet it does reveal the wide scope of her influence. How did it happen? This incredible impact of one author. And why Jane Austen? That question is asked constantly by everyone, by lovers of Austen and those who aren't huge fans. Is there an easy answer, or is it complex? Let's go back to the beginning, as it were, and step through time to the present. Perhaps we can discover the answer to why Jane Austen together. Jane Austen was born in 1775. Her father was an Anglican clergyman and teacher, and other than a year in a school for girls, Jane's education was informally administered by her father. She died in 1817 at the age of 41. In her life, she completed 6 novels. Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, and Mansfield Park were published between 1811 and 1816. Reviews for these 4 novels were minimal and rated lukewarm to favorable. The printing sold well, enough to encourage publishing the next books, and while considered a moderate success, Austen's profits were inadequate for her to live on. If not for the financial support from her brothers, she may well have been unable to keep writing. Thankfully, we'll never know. Her novels were published anonymously and attributed to a lady. Very few people knew Jane Austen was an author at all, let alone the author of these novels. Word spread, of course, including to the Prince Regent himself. He was a huge fan and requested that Emma be dedicated to him. It was a definite offer not to be refused, despite her dislike for the prince. Yet aside from this small piece of notoriety, Jane Austen was far from famous. She remained unmarried, lived a quiet life with her family, mostly in the country. She never gave a speech, never held a book signing, and never sat for an interview. She died after a brief illness and was buried in Winchester Cathedral. Her tombstone does not mention her literary career. Later in the same year that she died, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published. This time her brother, Henry Austen, identified her as the author and revealed her as the author of the previous 4. And as with the others, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were well received, and they sold, but not enough to earn a second printing. From 1818 to 1833, Austen's novels were not actively in print. Finally, in 1833, publisher Richard Bentley reissued all 6 novels in a set. Initial sales were moderately successful, if not record-breaking, but enough to warrant a second printing. Since then, her novels have remained consistently in print. In 1826, Sir Walter Scott wrote, and I quote, "Read again, for the 3rd time at least, Miss Austen's finely written novel of Pride and Prejudice. That young lady had a talent for describing the involvements and feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. The big bow wow strain I can do myself, like any now going. But the exquisite touch, which renders ordinary, commonplace things and characters interesting from truth of the description and the sentiment, is denied to me. In 1843, Lord Macaulay wrote in the Edinburgh Review, quote, "Shakespeare has neither equal nor second, but among writers who, in the point we have noticed, have approached nearest the manner of the great master, we have no hesitation in placing Jane Austen as a woman of whom England is justly proud." An extensive article in the February 1863 edition of The Atlantic quoted these two great men and many other commentators. The article's writer, Mrs. R.C. Watterson, concluded, and I quote, "Very much has been said in her praise, and we, in this brief article, have summoned together witnesses to the extent of her powers, which are fit and not few. While the English language is read, the world will always be provided with souls who can enjoy the rare excellence of that rich legacy left to them by her genius." We now know that Mrs. Watterson's prophetic words have come true. However, for every positive opinion during those decades, there was another of a negative bent. Yes, it's true. As amazing as it is for us to fathom, Jane Austen had many critics. Furthermore, these were the years of Charles Dickens, Henry James, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters, authors who wrote of gritty realism, powerful emotions, and dark psychological insights, popular styles that were at odds with Austen's genteel manners and polite satire. Therefore, despite the accolades and steady sales, Austen's classification as a great English writer and her wide-reaching fame was not established in the 19th century. The turning of the tide began gradually after 1870, when James Edward Austen Leigh, Jane's nephew, published a memoir of Jane Austen. His sanitized version of Dear Aunt Jane was factually questionable, but it appealed to the Victorian audience. Sales of her novels surged, requiring numerous reprintings over the subsequent 20 years. For the first time, fancy bindings were used and illustrations were added to enhance the text. It was the first wave of Austen mania, and exactly like today, the question arose, why Jane Austen? Critics dubbed it Austen-olatry and dismissed her sudden shine in the spotlight. Dozens of writings focused on criticism of Austen's novels were published during the last quarter of the 19th century, more in fact than the previous 70-plus years combined. But oddly, this rampant critiquing inspired England's academia to take a closer look at Jane Austen, with a series of academic studies and publications a result. The first was an essay in 1911 by Oxford Shakespearean professor A.C. Bradley. Next came a scholarly edition of her collective works in 1923. And then Jane Austen and Her Art by Mary Lascelles in 1939. These three were only the beginning, but were, and still are to this day, considered the foundation of Austen's elevation. Her juvenilia and unfinished works were included in these studies and eventually published as well. As we know, the analysis of Austen from a scholarly point of view continues to this day. The naysayers, while inevitably out there, have been overwhelmed and nearly silenced by the collective literary elite who long ago declared Austen's genius. This academic approach led to the formation of the Jane Austen Society in the UK in 1940 and in North America in 1979. The stated mission is to foster among the widest number of readers the study, appreciation, and understanding of Jane Austen's works, her life, and her genius. To this end, the many worldwide Jane Austen societies have performed brilliantly. Additionally, it was while this debate over Austen's value hotly raged in the early decades of the 20th century that the literary elite coined the term Janeite. It was meant to differentiate between those who fully appreciated and comprehended Austen, that is, the professors and literati who examined her novels, from the general masses who merely read and enjoyed them. So now let's talk about the general masses I just mentioned. This is where the history lesson becomes very interesting as far as I'm concerned. As the century turned and Austen's star truly started to soar, it followed two different but parallel paths. As I see it, both paths are valid, are worthy, and complement the other. Not everyone agrees, and I'm not here to convince, but only tell the facts. You can decide. So, while the academia of Austen was gaining strength, one pathway, the beginning threads of what we now refer to as pop culture were formulating, and that's the second pathway. 100 years after her death, the first true fan-inspired novel was written. Sybil G. Brinton's Old Friends and New Fancies, an imaginary sequel to the novels of Jane Austen, was published in 1914. It wasn't particularly successful, and in the subsequent decades only sporadic Austen-esque novels were published. But Brinton's novel is credited with launching the Austen literary genre. In 1921, Georgette Heyer published The Black Moth, the first of her 34 Georgian and Regency-era romance novels. Heyer unabashedly borrowed from Austen and single-handedly created both the historical and Regency romance genres. Heyer's novels relied heavily on research to bring alive an era at that time 100 years in the past. Her details in describing society, fashion, the settings, the language and cant, and the atmosphere of Georgian and Regency England aided in the comprehension of Jane Austen's novels for the average reader. Remember that Austen wrote of her contemporary world for her contemporary readers. There was no need to explain social mores or describe the scenery or clothing to readers who were living then. However, the further removed people were from those eras, the less understood certain aspects of her story were. And when you also have the top minds in the highest universities aligning Austen with Shakespeare, talk about daunting. Heyer's novels bridged the gap and encouraged more and more readers to turn to the source material, as it were. Also, this was the 1920s. There was a resurgence of romanticism everywhere. Austen's novels did not perfectly fit the dramatic, high romance style of that time, but they are romances. Heyer's novels, clearly following the tone and style of Austen, as Heyer freely admitted, without question had a massive impact on Austen's popularity as a storyteller. Once again, Austen's novels skyrocketed and crossed the pond in large numbers, along with Heyer, to become a sensation in America. And what inevitably happens when something becomes popular in the United States? Hollywood comes calling. In 1940, the first Austen movie was made, Pride and Prejudice, starring Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier by MGM. It was a huge success, yet strangely the only theatrical adaptation for another 55 years. Television, on the other hand, was mad about Austen. Over 20 different presentations dramatized the novels of Austen between 1938 and 1990. Then, in 1995, Hollywood, the BBC, and filmmakers everywhere went off the deep end. In 1996, Time magazine ran a headline asking, "Sick of Jane Austen yet?" That same year, the Wall Street Journal, in a front-page assessment, argued that Jane Mania, as they called it, was wholly cash-driven, mere capitalism at play. Her immediate impact was so far-reaching that the Socialist Workers' Party Marxist 1996 conference featured a session on what is so great about Jane Austen. Austen had become not only a cinematic icon, but a social force to be reckoned with. Devotees snatched the Janeite appellation away from the literary elite, so to speak. The term applied to all who are passionate about Austen, however they come to her door. In a blink, Austen was everywhere on the silver screen. Major movies, multi-episode series, modern adaptations, Bollywood, documentaries, foreign language, Austen-inspired, and even, eventually, on YouTube. 30 productions were made for TV and cinema in the 19 years from 1995 to 2014. And there are 5 productions that I know of planned for 2015. Of course, we cannot forget the simultaneous rise of Jane Austen fanfiction. Over the years since Sybil Brighton's, various authors wrote and published Austen-inspired novels, but none resulted in big waves until the late 1990s. Why? Well, there are probably several factors, but 2 reasons are indisputable. Number 1, the invention of the internet. With sites like the Republic of Pemberley, Austen.com, and eventually a passel of blogs centering on Jane Austen, she was literally everywhere. And number 2, Andrew Davies brilliantly directed Colin Firth to dive into a pond and emerge in a wet shirt. Yes, of course, there is so much more to the fabulous 1995 BBC version of Pride and Prejudice than Colin Darcy, wet or dry. But no one can deny that sexing up Austen had a profound effect. Andrews planned it that way, and it worked. Arguments as to the pros and cons still rage, and probably always will, but facts are facts. Linda Birdall, author of Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife, admits that her writing inspiration was fed by the BBC miniseries. Birdall wasn't the first author to jump on the fanfiction bandwagon, but the incredible success of her best-selling Pride and Prejudice sequel changed everything. Jane Austen-inspired novels entered a realm previously inhabited almost exclusively by fans of Star Wars, Star Trek, and other fantasies. More importantly, the stature of Austen meant that by and large, authors continuing her world did so with a serious literary mindset. The plethora of fiction novels published in the past 2 decades, numbering easily 200 or more, have provided lovers of Austen a way to keep her characters alive. And they've provided an avenue for others to discover Austen. It's a win-win, as I see it. But Jane Mania did not stop with books and movies. In every way imaginable, the time was ripe for Austen to take over the world. Technology had already, even in 1995, reached a point where just about anything was possible. Want a t-shirt with Mr. Darcy on it? No problem. Want to listen to the movie soundtrack wherever you are? Players galore. Want to chat with other Austen fanatics? There's a forum for that. And how about dressing in an Empire gown and drinking tea? Sure, no problem. We had entered a digital media, market-crazy, pop culture-saturated world. The passion for Jane Austen fit right in. We all know that Austen is everywhere, and I mean literally everywhere. Scientists are naming mouse pheromones after Mr. Darcy, for goodness sakes. Austen isn't alone, of course. Hollywood and the BBC love historical events, historical people, and classic literature. I've seen the Jane Austen action figure on the shelf besides Charles Dickens and Beethoven. I have friends active in the Sherlock Holmes Society. And how many versions of Jane Eyre are there now? Austen isn't alone as a cultural phenomenon, true. But she is indubitably the leader of the pack. So now we have arrived at the present. Have you discovered your answer to the question, why Jane Austen? I know what I believe, but if you still aren't sure, perhaps these 8 quotes by other folks attempting to answer the question will help. So here we go. One reason, of course, is that Austen is a great writer. She is a gifted stylist, concise, witty, ironic, and a master of the miniature. Thanks to her sharp wit and strong female characters, Jane Austen's literature is still utterly relevant. She was one of the first women to deliver humor and intelligence to subject matter previously thought frivolous and sub-intellectual. Through her novels, she taught everyone the real meaning of love. Austen's novels are full of excellent teaching. Throughout all of her works, a sweet lesson of household virtue is ever being taught. Duty and honor are 2 of the most common themes in literature, and Austen touches on these in her novels. But her characters are overwhelmingly preoccupied with finding happiness, and so are we. Austen's novels unite social realism, comic satire, and romance in a formula that has proven both durable and highly successful. Those who yearn for traditional values cling to the notions of romance and place, the quest to find love, financial security, and someone with the appropriate lifestyle. For the more progressive-minded, Austen offers an alternative glimpse of women during a time when they had little freedom. Another reason for her popularity is nostalgia for the chivalry and dignity of a previous age, imagined or real. What I love about these 8 summations is that they're all kind of the same, but they're all kind of different. They tell a little something different about why people love Jane Austen, but yet they're all true. I tried to sum it up myself. I was going to write a nice pretty verse that gave my reasonings. And then I read this quote by Austen scholar Amanda Vickery. And she says it so perfectly that I'm going to end with her quote. And she says, Austen leaves room for the reader's intelligence and fantasies, which has the uncanny effect of allowing each new generation to see themselves reflected back from the pages. And in another 200 years, I am sure readers still will.